Let me call you to order. I thought that maybe, given the title of the event tonight, we should start with some housekeeping rules. So my name is Caroline Levitt. I'm a senior lecturer here at the Courtauld, and I think that they have asked me to chair this forum this evening because I specialise in 19th and 20th century art, or the long 20th century might be a more appropriate way of putting it, in particular word and image and the relationship between modern art and the sacred. So that's me. I'm currently writing a book about doubt. I will introduce you to the rest of tonight's speakers in a moment. But before I do that, let me just give you a few things, just some practical things. If there's a fire alarm, we're not expecting one. I don't think there will be. But that means that if there is, we actually do have to get out. It won't be a drill. So there are some stairs that way and there are some stairs that way. That way is probably better because you can get all the way down to the bottom. So just follow us if you need to. If you need the toilet at all, then they're just out in the corridor over there. And on a really belligerent practical note, if you're able to easily, without it being a real pain, could you possibly, if you're sitting kind of in the aisle, just move slightly further in if you've got space to do so, just because I know what will happen in about 10 minutes, a few people will turn up and they won't be able to find a seat on the edge, and it would just be easier for them if there was one in the aisle. Thank you. That's really mean, isn't it? Thank you very much, I appreciate it.
The limitations of this room as well.
Thank you. I think that's it for rules, I promise, until we get on to discussing rules in more detail. So the plan this evening is that we've got several people who are going to respond to the book, but Jessica and Ed will speak to us a little bit about the book and the project and the exhibition and how they come together before we have those responses. So we'll have an introduction, some responses from the panel members, and then we'll have a little bit of a panel discussion. And then we will open up to questions from the audience. So please do have those questions in mind and start taking some notes down as you're hearing things. And we will get to that point a little bit further in. We're planning to finish by 7, so we won't keep you too long, and then there are drinks afterwards. But it's a wonderful opportunity to celebrate and to thank Jessica and Ed for what I think is a really exciting, rigorous, compelling, but at the same time really accessible book. I mean, it's incredible actually. I've got it here. There you go. This is what it is that we're celebrating, and we'll be selling it afterwards over drinks as well, obviously. Do buy a copy. But it is really interesting reading. It's genuinely accessibly written, compelling, and incredibly contemporary and relevant. And I know that that's been a really important part of the project for them. So thank you to Ed and Jessica, and we look forward to discussing all of what you've done in more detail, but thank you for making it such an interesting and helpful thing for us, as well as being a really fascinating exhibition. I don't know if people have had a chance to get to Norwich yet to see the show. It hasn't been open very long and it's on until October, so if you want a nice day trip out to Norwich, assuming you're London based, which you may not be, then please do go and see that at some point in the next few months. It's really worth doing. The Sainsbury Centre is always a treat anyway. I'm interested to know, as people were coming in, I said to Jessica, I think you're winning. I feel like we've got a good selection of medievalists here. Just stick your hand up if you would put yourself in a medievalist camp. I'm interested. Okay, thank you. Who thinks they're a modernist? Let's stand up for the modernists. Okay, we're losing here, so we're going to have to try and be a bit stronger, aren't we? Well, thank you all for coming. It's kind of just good to know who's in the audience. And thank you for coming out on a slightly rainy summer evening. Without further ado, I will tell you who we have speaking to the book this evening. So Jessica Barker is a specialist in medieval art with a particular emphasis on sculpture. She studied at the University of Oxford and the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she was subsequently Henry Moore Postdoctoral Fellow. She joined the Courtauld in 2018 after 2 years as a lecturer in wild art at the University of East Anglia. Her prize-winning monograph, Stone Fidelity, Marriage and Emotion in Medieval Tomb Sculpture, explores the intersection of love and death in funerary art. She's published widely on late medieval sculpture, with articles in journals including Art Bulletin, Art History, the Burlington Magazine, Jester, and the Sculpture Journal. And her partner in putting together the exhibition is Ed Krčma, who is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of East Anglia, and he works on a range of 20th and 21st century art, with a focus on the history and theory of drawing, the transactions between art and literature, and the ways in which recent art comes into dialogue with that of the more remote past. His first monograph, Rauschenberg and Dante, Drawing a Modern Inferno, was published by Yale University Press in 2017, and his articles have appeared in Art History, Oxford Art Journal, Burlington Magazine, Umani Art and American Art. He's also contributed to catalogue texts for exhibitions at numerous venues, including the Museum of Modern Art, New York, Tate Modern, the Fruit Market Gallery and Matt's Gallery. We also have with us this evening Michael Newman and Nancy Thibault, but I will introduce them more fully to you when they come up to give their responses. So let's hear from Jessica and Ed. Do give them a round of applause.
Hi everyone, and thank you Caroline for being our abbess this evening. You really inhabit the role beautifully. And it's a real, pleasure and honour to share this project with you all and to talk about it and to kind of have your responses. So thank you all for coming. As Caroline said, Ed and I are going to quite briefly, in about 10 minutes, give a very short overview of the project, the book and the exhibition, and just give a sense of our kind of thinking, where the project came from, our motivations for doing it, and some of the sort of key coordinates that guided us in the process of shaping it. So Living by the Rule explores the rules and rules cultures that structure daily life. And we do this by placing contemporary conditions in dialogue with a strong, and for most people, a very alien counter-image, medieval monasticism, and specifically the Rule of St Benedict. So the question that we kind of pose in the exhibition and the book to visitors and readers are, what are the priorities and structures of your everyday life? So this is the kind of entry question for both the show and the book. And the reason that we enter into monasticism through this question, what are the priorities and structure of your everyday life, is because we felt that there is a kind of contemporary fascination with this question. The idea of rules, the idea of the kind of optimization of everyday life. So Atomic Habits, the 5 a.m. Club, this is just a kind of small selection of the wellness section of bookshops that I could have extracted to illustrate this point. And these books are very much about kind of optimization and the idea of that if you could find a perfect routine, it would solve all of your problems. There's also an interest in monasticism specifically. There's a sort of burgeoning genre of monasticism-specific wellness. One of the most important ones that we looked at when thinking about the show is this New York Times best-selling book called Rod Dreher, called The Benedict Option. He's actually a very problematic figure, kind of circulates in Trumpist circles and was an advisor to Viktor Orban. But this was a best-selling book. This was a really kind of popular book that came out in 2017. And then kind of bringing it really right up into the present day, there's a kind of burgeoning kind of AI and daily routine. So there's this kind of new series of AI tools that allow you to enter your sort of commitments and priorities, and these AI planners will create a daily routine for you. What does it mean to be obedient in this way to a large language model rather than an abbot or abbess? This is the question that comes to mind. I also think there's a generational question here. Arguably, in the 60s and 70s, young people felt rules in public and political life to be part of the problem. Now, I would say, today, it's political lawlessness and disregard for international rules and norms that is the problem in the eyes of the younger generation. So we wanted to speak to all of these current concerns. But we wanted to do that by looking into the really deep past. So the Rule of St Benedict, Benedict lived in the early 16th century. Benedict lived in the early 6th century during the final decades of the Roman Empire. A period of continual conflict when many of the old rules governing society and politics were sort of collapsing around him. A period in which private wealth and brute power were in the ascendant and the sort of older public and collective frameworks were decaying. So Benedict is not the first person to think of monasticism, nor the first person to develop a monastic rule. But what he did was attempt to carve out a different and distinctive way to live. And his rule is much more detailed than previous monastic rules, and it very much seems to be the product of lived experience, his own experiments and failures. So the kind of nitty-gritty that he goes into about when to serve meals, how to schedule sleep, the order in which people should do things. They're very practical and they very much seem to respond to someone that's actually tried to live these rules out. The Benedictine rule, though, is also profoundly alien in a contemporary context, in its principles and its practices. And I think these principles and practices, these very alien ideas, are both attractive and repulsive today in a social realm premised on individual freedoms and autonomy. So to give some examples, the Benedictine vow of stabilitas, the idea you commit to one place and one group of people for the entirety of your life. The idea of obedience, of being obedient to the abbot or abbess, no matter what they say, no matter if they order you to do something that's actually against the rules, you should always obey them. And then the idea of having no private property, not owning anything yourself. I also think, finally, the Benedictine rule is for monks that live in community. He's very clear about that in the preface. And the fundamental question is, how do we live well together? Many of his prescriptions are actually about how to resolve kind of arguments and disputes between people. How do we rub together with other people? How do we get along with the people we didn't choose to be with? And even though we live in a world where those kind of social ties are fraying, most of us still have the experience of that, whether it's in family, school or work, the idea that you're thrown together with a small group of people you didn't choose and you have to find a way to get along. So we felt that there was something important there, the idea of living together, and that question today was perhaps more urgent than it's ever been. So in focusing on Benedict's rule, we wanted to go back to the kind of radical first principles of monasticism, and also to kind of work against the 19th century romanticization of monastic life, sloughing off some of the encrustations of later traditions. But at the same time, the exhibition and the book are deeply interested in the failures and the compromises involved in living out the rule in particular communities at particular times and places. So hence the title, Living by the Rule. What we wanted to get at is not just the ideal, but also how people lived it. So we focus on these particular communities, Canterbury in the 11th and 12th centuries, Norwich from the 12th to the 16th century, Ely in the 15th century. And monastic art really speaks to those two poles, the ideals and the lived reality. These micro-histories allow us to get to the texture of how the rules were followed or not. And our interest here is less in the fact that monks and nuns were breaking the rules, but rather how the rules were broken, the kind of administrative and ideological gymnastics that they engaged in, and which we still engage in, to enable them to have their cake and eat it at the same time. So what happens when you put medieval monastic art in dialogue with contemporary artists? What's gained in both directions, the medieval and contemporary? There's lots to say here, and I hope that this will be kind of the basis for our discussion this evening. But I just wanted to offer a few preliminary coordinates that we can go on to expand on. So there's two important things that we really didn't want to do in this exhibition. The first was present the medieval as a kind of ideal to return to, and engage in this kind of idealization or mystique around the figure of the monk. Obviously, there's a long history of the fascist sort of recuperation of the medieval as a model for contemporary life, and we absolutely didn't want to participate in that. The other thing we didn't want to do is set up the medieval as a kind of origin point for the contemporary, tracing a sort of the continuity of a theme or motif over time, or exploring sort of formal parallels between medieval and contemporary art. We felt that in this there was the risk of stressing a kind of false continuity and too little negotiation of the radical structural differences in art and life between the medieval and contemporary worlds. What we ultimately wanted to get to in this medieval modern project is what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls form of life. That is, the practices that give shape and significance to daily life. And Benedict compares living well to crafting a work of art. It's a practice that should be the focus of sustained and repeated attention. And you also find this in the lives of the Desert Fathers, where they're focused absolutely just on prayer and on making. St Anthony prayed and then he plaited a cord. He prayed and plaited a cord. But getting down to form of life, exploring this through the medieval and the contemporary, means grappling with the structural conditions of art and life in the modern period and presenting the very significant distances and breaks between medieval and modern mass societies. And more speculatively, we also wanted to explore parallels between perhaps the condition of recent art and medieval monasticism, especially in terms of questions of autonomy and dependence. So one of the things that we sort of tentatively propose in this show is that there is a kind of structural parallel between the condition of the artist in the contemporary world and the condition of the monk in medieval society. So I'm going to pass over to Ed now, who's going to talk more about the kind of structure of the show.
Okay, so it's my role to give you a sense of both the exhibition and the book. This is going to be necessarily very brief, just to give you a sense of what's included. So the place where it is the Sainsbury Centre on the UEA campus in Norwich, Norman Foster building from the 70s. I'm showing you Whitby Abbey in ruins also. And the exhibition is organised into these sections, which I'm going to very briefly talk you through. To give you a sense first of the kinds of things and artists that are included, these are the artists involved. Kate Pickering with a performance that was staged a week or so after the opening, the others with work in the galleries themselves. So the few moderns in the room will perhaps recognise some of these figures. And to put a bit of flesh on the bones of what Jessica was saying about trying to get to the grain of particular medieval communities. So we sought objects from these particular places and times, focusing on Canterbury, Ely, and Norwich. And we're pretty pleased with positive responses we had from lenders on these, because there's some pretty extraordinary things, including the oldest surviving copy of the Rule of St Benedict in the world, the Hatton Codex from the Bodleian in Oxford, made around 690. Also, these three Psalters, the Ormsby, Galston and Macclesfield Psalters, all made in East Anglia and not in Norwich together since the Reformation. To give you a sense of the spatial organisation, I have 3 slides with kind of architectural plans, just to give you a sense of physically where the work is in space. So you enter the galleries via a spiral staircase down from floor level, and the first gallery, before we do any explanation of what the Benedictine rule is or its principles, we immediately wanted to stage an encounter between contemporary art and medieval survivals. The room is themed Tradition in Fragments, stressing that we encounter a monastic tradition in this country only in fragments, of course, after the English Reformation, the English Civil War. And we stress, using work by 3 contemporary artists and 3 medieval loans, the physical kind of fragmentation of that material tradition. So objects which have literally been dredged out of the Thames when they were making a larger sewerage system in London in the 19th century, or brought down from the Triforium with all the pigeon droppings in Ely Cathedral and brought into the galleries. So, physically fragmentary tradition, but also, I guess, a kind of ethical fragmentation. Some of the kind of more political ideas that Jessica raised just now to do with certain kinds of appropriations of medievalism by the right, which we can return to. I think other speakers will maybe return to that. So it was intended as a sort of visual kind of coup, something quite striking to bring you into the show. Before we offer an introductory sense of both the history of the Rule of St Benedict, its translation into lay terms through books of hours, and also translations into English in the Rule for Women, for example. A sense of the history and a sense of some of the principles. Firstly, key to this structure of communal living was a very precise routine, so that everybody is woken together, everyone prays together, they eat together. The temporal orchestration of a monastery is, really precise, but how do you tell the time? So, we got things about shadow measurement, sundials, but also they're fierce technophiles, so first mechanical clocks, 14th century, Norwich had an amazing one, doesn't survive. So thinking about the orchestration of time then, and also now, in our 24/7 world. Thinking about time and then about space, the vow stabilitas that Jessica mentioned, the commitment to a community and a place your whole life. Thinking about what that might mean, and also thinking about the drive towards autonomy of that community. So a certain ideal of self-sufficiency, which would be apart from the world. And as soon as you start talking about questions about kind of autonomy or removed from everyday life, it does bear, interestingly, I think, on the condition of art in recent times. And that's a complex story. But the structural parallel that Jessica introduced, a kind of remove from the way of the world. And that's something we wanted to explore kind of structurally in terms of art and in terms of monastic form of life. So having outlined some pretty broad histories and principles, we then move into a large, it's more segmented than this with the exhibition design, but a large gallery 2, where we take 3 specific spaces within the monastery and explore their function in relation to particular kinds of practice and therefore particular kinds of problem for now. So the 3 that we chose, and obviously we could have chosen more or different ones, the refectory, eating, drinking, consumption, so thinking about community, consumption, property, also, and this is shading into the almonry, questions about charity, who's in, who's out there. Benedict's rule was particular in terms of the role he gave to welcoming strangers and giving charity, and the Norwich community were feeding an extraordinary amount, 6% of the population each day, in the 14th century. The refectory and consumption, chapter house and discipline, obedience, authority, thorny questions for now, kind of difficult ones, especially for sort of liberal and left positions tend to be quite sceptical of this kind of question of charismatic authority or a certain form of authority. So that's something to work through. Kind of bureaucratic libido gets in there as well. You might be familiar with that. And the choir, lastly. The main work of the monks is, of course, to sing their prayers, the divine office, and can't help the sort of relationship between the divine office and office work. But thinking here, and maybe Michael, I don't know, you might talk a bit more about, measure. This is something we borrowed from Michael, measure, measurement, the immeasurable, what's the relationship? And here angling on to, these questions about the eternal. Okay, Kate's wonderful performance a week after the opening, and Kate's here, so if we want questions for her. The book itself has a distinct identity, but shares much. We couldn't and didn't particularly want to map exactly the structure of the show onto the book. It's a different object, and it has its own life, and it has its own purpose and rules. To show you the contents page, there's also different voices here. There's a long essay to start, and then we have 4 short section essays on these particular subjects, with 46 very short entries of particular works that are in the show, some short entries, works in focus. And then I really recommend it, wonderful exchange between Elizabeth Price and Andrea Butner on questions of faith, politics, religion, these things, super interesting. And also beautiful postscript by Aidan Cumler, a fantastic medievalist that many of you will be more familiar with than me. And that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for because I know it's had to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through, but I'm sure that we will hear a bit more detail as we go. Thank you very much. I think that was quite detailed, really, for the amount of time you had. We've now got a couple of people who are going to respond, and the first of those is Nancy. Nancy Thibault is Associate Professor of History of Art at the University of Oxford and Tutorial Fellow at St Catherine's College. She recently co-curated the exhibition Spectrum of Desire, Love, Sex and Gender in the Middle Ages, which was on view at the Met Cloisters earlier this year, and she co-authored the accompanying catalogue with Melanie Holcomb. Her research interests range widely. She's published on Carolingian and Ottonian manuscripts and ivories, queer approaches to art of the late Middle Ages, and the ways that medieval and contemporary art have been put in dialogue, so very relevant to this evening. She's currently completing a book on early medieval images of Christ, specifically at moments when he is absent or partially obscured from view. And after Nancy, so I'll just let you follow straight on from each other, we have Michael. Michael Newman is writer and curator, and he's a professor of art writing at Goldsmiths, the University of London. He's published numerous essays on modern and contemporary artists, as well as thematic essays that combine philosophy and art history on the wound, the horizon, contingency, memory, nonsense, the anti-portrait, and boredom. He was the co-curator with Kate McFarlane of the exhibition Figures, Drawing After Belma, at the Drawing Room London in 2021. In 2024, he curated a three-part exhibition at Large Glass London titled After Mallarmé. He's currently developing a project on measurement, measure, and the immeasurable in relation to AI and other machines, so again, very relevant to you this evening. And he's the co-director of a new initiative at Goldsmiths, the Drawing Centre for Humans and Machines, which will be holding a conference on the 24th to the 25th of June at the Drawing Room, if anybody's interested in looking that up. You could also catch him this Friday, if you wanted to, giving a paper on AI as the new oracle, Tarot's insights into probabilistic machine, I'm not going to be able to say that, probabilistic machines at the Goldsmiths Conference, Tarot Cultures. So thank you very much to Nancy and Michael, and I'll let you come up and give your response to things. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Caroline. And thanks so much, Jessica and Ed, for thinking of me and inviting me to respond to the book and the show this evening. And congratulations, first of all. Both projects are just so smart, thoughtful, clearly done with so much care. And I'd like to begin my brief remarks this evening by thinking a little bit about the larger art historical context of your book and show. So in some ways, I find that you're participating in a longer tradition of pairing medieval and contemporary art. But you're also doing something that is quite different too, specifically when it comes to thinking about politics. So we've seen this pairing in other publications in the past few years. I'm thinking, for instance, of some of the books I have on the screen here, like Amy Knight Powell's Depositions, in which she pairs medieval images of the deposition and entombment of Christ with contemporary works like Solowit's Buried Cube, that also involve the removal, even burial, of an art object. And we also witnessed such pairings in Bob Mills' book on the filmmaker Derek Jarman, as well as in Alex Nagel's book, Medieval Modern, in which both authors are thinking about the ways that medieval works of art inspired modern artists. And I couldn't resist, I had to also put up the cover for the most recent issue of Texture Kunst, which is typically a contemporary art journal. It just came out, I think, last week, and this entire issue is devoted to medieval art and thinking a lot about medieval modern pairings. So something's in the air. We've also seen these medieval modern pairings in different gallery spaces, such as in Make It New at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which paired manuscripts and enlarged reproductions of the Carolingian theologians Rabanus Morris's figural poems alongside works by artists like Donald Judd, Carl Andre, and Franz Walter. Or we could think of the show A Gagosian Critical Dictionary in homage to Georges Bataille, which paired pre- and early modern paintings with primarily modern sculpture. Or a place like the Colombo Museum in Cologne, which is owned and run by the Archdiocese and routinely features medieval and contemporary art side by side. And of course, the pairing of medieval and contemporary art is not just a recent phenomenon. So Meyer Shapiro famously paired medieval and modern art in his lectures at Columbia. Here we see him talking about the similar line quality in a medieval manuscript and a painting by Kandinsky. So scholars and curators have compared medieval and modern art for a variety of reasons, whether to understand the ways that the medieval has influenced contemporary art, to prompt art historians to see work from both periods in new light, and to insist on the modernity of the Middle Ages, sort of this like, well, we have abstraction too in our period. And although Living by the Rule might share some goals with these projects, I think that its focus on structure and politics ultimately make it quite different. So the project foremost highlights, this is in Aidan Kumler's terms, quote, the structural parallel that exists between modern art and the monastery. But identifying that parallel is not an end in itself. The project overtly issues an invitation to the viewer to rethink how to live, work, and perhaps most importantly, create community. So in the space of the exhibition, you all invite us to think about this in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's by asking us to think about time through the juxtaposition of a table for measuring shadows, a rotating timekeeping device, or Susan Morris's sunshine tapestries, as well as through this diagram that makes clear how we spend more time working than medieval people did, which is quite a depressing realization. But at other moments, it's by foregrounding what you call the, quote, affective capacities of so many of your chosen objects. I love how you strategically play with sightlines and enshrine otherwise humble objects to evoke the humans that once interacted with them. So one juxtaposition that really moved me was the pairing of Andrea Buettner's table with a series of mazers, or cups used by individual monks over the course of their lifetime. And then above those mazers, you have Vivian Asaya Courland's painting of a Seder dinner. So together, these works conjure the presence of a community sitting around a table and prompt reflection on who is allowed into that community, how it functions, and ultimately how we make family. This particular juxtaposition also made me see medieval mazers anew. These aren't objects, to my knowledge, that have been the subject of a lot of exciting, sexy art historical work, but in this context, they really command attention and are a powerful reminder of the important role that an individual object can play in one's daily life, and even how it can come to stand in for that life once the cup's owner has passed. Another object that I now see quite differently after seeing it in the context of your show and reading about it in the book was this 13th century seal box, which once held the seal matrix of the Benedictine Cathedral Priory at Norwich, which you see at left. So you tell us in the catalog and in the wall text that the keys were held by 3 different office holders, all of whom would need to be present to open the box and access the seal. So for me, seeing the 6 keys in the box is a poignant reminder of how an object's very design could be premised on the importance of community and the collective care of an object, in this case, an image that represented who they were. So these pairings and even singular objects, which I would have not in a different context have been so moved by, I think, are politically charged. They invite reflection on care, community, and kinship at a moment when there is a hardening of traditional notions of family on the far right and increasing individualism all around. The political valence of your show became even more explicit in the book. In the introduction, you very firmly distinguish your project from those who would romanticize and distort Benedict's rule and the Middle Ages in order to uphold right-wing, racist, and Christian nationalist projects. But you also point to the liberatory possibilities that the Middle Ages, juxtaposed with the contemporary, might actually hold, specifically in the era of late-stage capitalism and increased surveillance at work. At the very least, these objects and encounters between medieval and modern prompt, quote, in your words, critical reflection upon present conditions. So these juxtapositions in your show are unruly as you have it in the most wonderful of ways, and they inspire us to be unruly too. And ultimately, by thinking critically about the Benedictine rule, which is a text that I'm now seeing in totally new ways, you show that, quote, life can always be lived otherwise, which at this moment, I think isn't just a reminder, but even a call to action. So thank you for your wonderful exhibition and book, and I will turn it over to Michael.
It's an honor to be asked to celebrate this show and this book, both of which I think were magnificent. I visited the show twice and I saw completely different things the two times. So I recommend not one visit, but many to you. The installation is fantastic, and it really also generates thinking. And I think the book is wonderful too. I've read it right through, and I was impressed both with the essays, but also the texts on the individual works are absolute gems, I think, of writing. So congratulations on the book. I'm going to begin at the end of the book with the postscript by Aben Kumler, in which Aben Kumler draws attention to the Desert Father, Sir Anthony Abbott, who had the experience of acedia, which is, of course, the medieval form of boredom, from which he then founded monastic communities. So you could say the monastic movement comes out of boredom, which I think is totally fantastic. And I'm also thinking that there must have been long periods of boredom being a monk as well. So you could say that the monastery is a kind of technology to deal with boredom. And I think that's very interesting in the present, because we're experiencing a transformation of boredom thanks to social media and all sorts of other things, the rhythm of work, etc. That the transformative experience of boredom is turning into another kind of boredom in relation to another kind of temporality. And that other kind of boredom is also connected with the question of attention and the harvesting of attention by social media, digital means, etc. And of course, not only is the monastery a technology of boredom, it's also a kind of technology of attention, as is the exhibition for that matter. There's a very interesting thing about the exhibition is the way that it orchestrates your attention as you're walking through it. But obviously the monastery also was a sort of technology for orchestrating attention and dealing with boredom. And one of the aspects of this, both then and now, as Ed has pointed out, is the question of measurement. Measurement both spatially, the measurement of the monastery itself, the plan of the monastery itself, but also, and crucially, the measurement of time in the life of the monk. And that, I'm going to approach this, as you can already tell, rather at an angle, both at an angle from my own interest, but also at an angle spinning off some ideas that I thought of in experiencing the exhibition. I'm showing here effectively three rulers. I mean, that's one thought that, one sort of jump that I had from the rule to the ruler. And I'm going to talk about the ruler in two senses, both the ruler that you measure with, but the ruler that is the master as well. This is the three standard stoppages of Duchamp. Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button. And here is the three standard stoppages with its box, a replica of the original version from 1913 to 1914. Now, Duchamp made these three standard stoppages by dropping a 1 meter thread and then creating a ruler from the configuration in which the thread fell. So you see the thread on on this sort of black, I think it's kind of velvet ground. And then you see the ruler that was made from it. So of course, each ruler is different. And the standard of measure is sheerly contingent. It's contingency. Now that raises the question for me of what is the ground of measure and what is the ground of measurement, and how the ground of measure and measurement might relate to the immeasurable, as Ed mentioned. So of course, for the medievals, the ground of measure is God. But then the question that arises for Duchamp, and I argue elsewhere, this follows from actually Mallarmé, and Mallarmé's atheism, his atheist crisis. What happens to measure when the ground of measure, whatever it might be, in this case God, is lost, and measure becomes contingent? So it's a sort of almost like arbitrary choice of a standard. And I think that is what Duchamp is getting at with the three standard stoppages. And the display is interesting too, because it's displayed like the standard meter in Paris. So it's like in a box, almost like a kind of relic. I mean, some of the display reminds me a little bit about the displays in the exhibition. Now, another aspect of measurement, I mentioned spatial measurement. Is a question around that for me is the question of what is included and what is excluded. You know, how does the border function, or how does the sort of both literally and metaphorically, the sort of walls of the monastery. Monastery is a kind of enclosure. What happens in relation to this enclosure to the other, to the monstrous? We see the monstrous, in a sense, included in the experience of misericords, and there's a misericord in the exhibition, these kind of shallow seats under which are, from the chapel, under which are carved sort of monstrous scenes. There's also the question of, you know, what happens in the margins of medieval manuscripts. So the monstrous, in a sense, is excluded, but the community also, perhaps like as all communities, founds itself on a certain exclusion. How does this work in terms of medieval Christianity? Well, let me just find my place. There's a magnificent work by Vivian Corland in the exhibition called Vive Maman, which is based on a drawing, much enlarged, of a little boy, let me just, a Jewish boy, Jacques Ben-Gigi. He made it as a Mother's Day gift in May 1943. The boy was deported via Drancy on his 13th birthday. His mother, who survived the camp, acted as a plaintiff against Klaus Barbie in his trial. Corland borrows Jacques' drawing and script, radically enlarging them to fill the painting. There are other elements to this which are, so I haven't got a picture of it, but it was actually shown earlier on, which are also book pages of medieval chapels and so on, and a newspaper about one of the first people to be publicly executed by the Nazis on Soviet soil, Masha Brusinska, who was a teenage Belarusian Jew, and there's a sort of newspaper thing about that. But the text also mentions says, Corwin's painting reminds us of the central role that Norwich played in the eventual expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. So and that really, I think, raises the question of the question of otherness, as it were, then and now. And I think that's an important question to raise, obviously, in the context of the growth of racism and the far right at the moment, and the sort of combination, as was shown, of a certain far right embrace of a certain kind of myth of the medieval in relation to racism. Now, related to this is another aspect of the rule that the show made me think about, which is how are rules related to different forms of pleasure? Or perhaps rather, how do rules involve a relationship to pleasure? You could say that for the obsessional, the rules are a way of keeping an overwhelming and destructive jouissance at bay. You follow the rules rigorously, otherwise, pleasure will come too close and you will be kind of destroyed as a subject by it. But there are also other relationships to pleasure. The relationship specifically that I'm thinking of is in masochism and in sadism. Gilles Deleuze wrote a really classic introduction to Saccamaso's Venus in Furs, where he talks about how rules function in the relationship of masochism. It appears that the dom is in control of the rules, but Deleuze argues, in fact, it's the sub who controls the rules, because it's the sub who's getting pleasure out of the rules being imposed. I mean, if you fold this back on monasticism, you can ask, what is the pleasure that the monks are getting from, obeying the rules? Is it a kind of masochistic pleasure? What exactly is involved? The other side, of course, is also sadism. And I'm showing here a still from Pasolini's film Salo, or 120 Days of Sodom from 1975, which is based on the Marquis de Sade's 120 Days of Sodom. And it is a kind of quasi-monastery in Salo, which is the last outpost of the Italian fascists that was under Nazi control. And it's about a group of men. I mean, there are women involved, obviously, in it as well in other scenes. I mean, in the sort of controlling aspect as well as in the sort of victim aspect. So the men are a duke, a bishop, a magistrate, and the president. So the representatives of power. And what this film demonstrates, this is a profoundly anti-fascist film. What it demonstrates is that power is power over bare life. So we're coming back to sort of Agamben, who Ed mentions. And the film also raises the question of, I mean, there are rituals in the film. There's a kind of mock marriage ceremony, and there are other rituals that take place in the film. So it's a sort of parallel with rituals that might take place in a monastery. The question that arises, what is the role of these rituals in relation to power? And you can refer to a different book by Agamben, The Power and the Glory, where he talks about the way in which absolute power needs these rituals of glory to sustain its power over their life. So so that's perhaps another aspect that I thought of in relation to the exhibition. But I don't want to, I don't want to end this too negatively, because the sort of another aspect, as has been said, is that there's a dimension of this, which is of the exhibition, which is to do with the question of how should we live and how might we live otherwise. And the monastic life offering certain aspects that we would do well to think about in our own life. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a sort of dark and a light side, to this. I don't mean light in the sense of frivolous. I mean light in the sense of having some value in terms of thinking about our lives and thinking critically about the systems of power, control and surveillance that we live under, and how it might be possible to withdraw and live differently. But in order to do that, I think we also need to think about both the darker sides of the rule and the relation of the rule to the generation of pleasure, which may be sort of beneficial pleasure, but can also be very dark pleasure.
Thank you very much, Michael and Nancy, for two kind of really imaginative ways of responding, I think, that take us out into the broader field. My own thoughts I will keep fairly brief, and then we will move into a panel discussion, but I couldn't resist just showing this in relation to the idea of the rule. So some of you may not be familiar with her work, some of you will be. Corita Kent was a nun working in 1950s and 60s Los Angeles. So she's working from within a kind of ecclesiastical order. And so the affinity with monasticism just seemed really really nice, actually. And I was thinking about just kind of moving on from Michael's thinking about unruliness, which I think is where we sort of got to with some of this. What is the other side of a rule? Her set of rules that she put together for the art department that she was in charge of at Immaculate Heart College seemed to really speak for me to the way in which Jessica and Ed have articulated the way that the Rule of St Benedict functioned. You describe it as lawmaking on a human scale, and I thought that was a really nice way of putting it. I also like this quote: "The abbot is the rule. What they decide becomes the rule, regardless of whether it deviates from the letter or even the spirit of the written text." We tend to write rules down, don't we? And it struck me that here we had a set of written rules, but even by the end of that, we've got rules about softness, we've got rules about trying, trusting, considering things. Nothing's a mistake, there's no fail. And then at the end, there should be new rules next week. This idea that rules are constantly shifting, constantly something to be reacted to and maybe adapted depending on the individuals who are following them. And that seemed to fit very neatly, actually, with what was going on in the 6th century rule that we've been talking about. But just linking to that, this idea that we write things down and that they become an authority struck me as a really interesting theme through the exhibition. Words tend to have authority over images somehow. Words are the things that you can understand. They're the privilege of the people who can read them. And they have an authority over the people who cannot very often. Images tend to respond to words, or we assume that they do, and they tend to illustrate them. But I think one of the things that your book and your exhibition does very cleverly, actually, is to pose that question of what happens to words when their authority is perhaps questioned, not to say undermined, and when the visual comes out on top. And really, it's an exhibition that responds very much to the idea of working to the letter, rules that are written down and stamped, but responding to those things visually. And there are a number of artworks in the exhibition that do that. Elizabeth Price's video installation has the sort of the sound going along with the visual, but then the words are written as captions. You don't hear those words narrated, but you see them as captions. And the ways in which those interact with the images that we're seeing on the screen is really fascinating. I haven't got an image of her work, but I'll come back to that one. But this is the column that Michael was talking about, and the way in which we've got this sort of palimpsestic layering of all of these different types of writing from different moments that are referencing periods other than their own, writing in different modes, writing in a kind of didactic mode that is teaching about architecture, which then gets taken on as a sort of stereotype, perhaps racially, alongside the news article, which claims another type of authority, doesn't it, but is of a very questionable type of truth. And then writ large over the top, the child's drawing with that very graphic gestural title, Vive Maman, written at the top of it. And the way in which artworks like this kind of subvert the authority not only of words over images, but of particular types of people over one another. And I love that idea that once you start to inhabit the rule, you become the rule. And I think that's something that really resonates a lot with modern and contemporary art, but that we can take from the way in which you've displayed that alongside medievalism. So that's really fascinating, and thank you. There are other artworks that engage very much with words and with book objects. This one's a particularly fascinating piece where law books have been taken apart, broken, stripped of their internal pages, pushed down to create a new artwork and then sort of stitched together in a way that you sort of got broken bodies and the remnants of skins that are left. And it's a way of thinking very much about the way that the law has been used to oppress, and in particular in the context of America, and even in very recent years, and you referenced George Floyd in the piece that you write about this particular artwork. So there are some very kind of moving and very contemporary aspects to this book that come out, and I think the word image sort of relationship just really struck me as being there, and that's probably partly to do with Ed's own specialism, I'm sure. There's the parallel boucle as well, which is far more playful in some ways, subverting and kind of laughing at the language of authority by pulling out of it a different sense of order. We get the A, B, C running through this list of definitions, which, if you just read them through, are so completely nonsensical, but they're the kinds of definitions we expect to find in the law, in the things that guide us and that rule us, that perhaps are completely incomprehensible. The following meanings: board means the executive board of the academic council of the school, council means the academic council of the school, director, I mean, it just goes on, doesn't it? And the script really encapsulates that sense of the kind of ridicule of rule. And just to return quickly to Corita Kent, for whom word and image was also a very important vessel. She's also an artist that Andrea Buchner has thought about a great deal in her own paintings, artworks in general, videos, all sorts of different media in which she works, prints. It's an Andrea Buchner print that we have on the front of the book, for example. And you can sort of see a resonance with the graphic style there. But I particularly like this piece, and in the short piece of writing that you give us to go with bread painting, you reference Corita Kent as someone that Buchner has thought about. And the way that bread is so much a part of imagery within the Catholic faith, the Christian faith. The idea that bread is a transformative object. It's sort of it's a transubstantiated object. There's something almost magical and mythical about bread. And Buchner sort of gives us the irony of the everyday object through using a loaf of bread that looks as if it's been handmade and beautiful. But even she contrasts that with the enriched bread, which is the supermarket loaf that you could buy in the States in the 1960s that Corita Kent uses in her artwork. And so actually they're making very similar points, but with completely different loaves of bread, which I think is a really fascinating resonance. There's a nice little sort of irony in Corita Kent's piece here. Helps build strong bodies 12 ways, a standard large loaf. And there's thinking there about 12 tribes and their manna, isn't there? And 12 disciples receiving bread at the Last Supper. All sorts of resonances going on there. In another piece that also uses Wonder Bread, she talks about there being no preservatives. This is something for now. And I think the sort of contemporaneity of what Corita Kent is doing in those works really resonates across not only with Andrea Buchner's works, but with the works of a lot of artists in your show. So that was just something that really spoke to me. And I think those word-image resonances are really powerful, and it's a great interface. But I won't go on any longer. Let's have everybody up to the front and let's discuss some of these ideas. I'm sure there's lots of things that we can talk about. I think we'll probably take, let's take about sort of 10 to 15 minutes for a panel discussion and then move over so that we've got some time for questions from the audience. I think we've got microphones up here, so we should be able to hear everybody. Great. Well, I think there are lots of things that we could consider together, and I'm not going to try and hold the floor particularly. I'm sure other people have got questions to ask as well. So in some ways, I suppose, we've brought out some resonances already, haven't we, in terms of measurement, in terms of unruliness. I don't know if there's anything, actually, I might just invite Michael and Nancy to respond to each other, if there's anything you particularly wanted to say back to each other from what you spoke about.
I mean, I was unexpected where you took us at the end there. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I'm not sure I have necessarily pressing responses. I think it's going to take me a little bit more time to digest what you proposed, but I mean, I wonder if it did make me think a little bit about omissions that maybe Ed and just things that you chose to leave out when thinking about rulers, people who enjoy following rules. I mean, I wonder, was Michael's presentation at all an invitation for you to think about what didn't make the cut in your checklist?
And we talked about sexuality and celibacy quite a lot, and how and to what extent to represent that in the show. Benedict doesn't talk about sex, and celibacy isn't one of the monastic vows, but obviously this is an aspect of monastic life that is extremely alien today and is something that people think about immediately when they think about monasticism. What I wanted to do, I think, from a medieval side, and I think I do this more successfully in the book than the show, arguably, is to think about how monasticism offers an alternative rule. So actually, monasticism offers an alternative kind of family, and that by following the monastic rule, especially women, but actually men too, could engage in kind of homosocial friendships and horizontal ties that would be much more would be different or differently formed within society outside the monastery. So exploring the fact that monasteries allowed for kind of single-sex communities, and the way in which the discussion of monastic love plays out between abbots and monks, but also between the way in which monks talk to each other about love and friendship, which they do a lot. So that was the sort of way I got at that question.
Yeah, perhaps I could add something to that, because one of the ways in which the medieval came into the modern in the 1960s was through female mysticism, medieval female mystics, and the relation of that was picked up by the French feminists like Couture Féminine, and then Lacan tried to kind of take it over in a certain way in his own writing. So, I mean, maybe that was one thing. I thought you might talk about a little bit of female pleasure in relation to the medieval thing. But the one person perhaps who picked it up is Kate Pickering, in a sense, in the idea of the anchorite. Maybe, Kate, do you want to say something about that?
Put you on the spot.
Maybe. I think I might need a bit of time to think about it.
That's fine.
So in terms of
How did you see what you were doing in relation to the show as a whole? Because you really added something. I would strongly advocate for it being done again. I think it's a shame it only was once.
well, I suppose I was contrasting the sort of unruliness of Julian's visions. Oh, thank you. I was contrasting the unruliness of Julian's visions with the rules that she would have followed. But of course, the rules that she followed were there because people were possibly breaking rules. So rules had to be written for class to follow. So I was interspersing some of the rules with her visions and my own history within and outside of the church, and the kind of strictures that I was under within that environment as well. Yeah, and then I guess the pleasure maybe comes in through the body and the relation, the kind of aspect of the mystical body that I was drawing out, the porousness of that body. And I don't know if I quite managed to do it in performance, but I'm kind of writing at the moment about morality and women meeting God through and through the eating of communion, or through kind of mystical, like the movement between the mystic's body and the body of God, and that kind of movement in and out of bodies. So I don't know if that's really an answer, but I'll stop there.
Lovely, thank you. And maybe I'll just add to that. I was lucky enough to be at your performance, and I really loved this wound that you had, and how you were reading from this piece of paper that was coming out of the wound. It made me think of all these images of very yonic forms of wounds in medieval art. This, broad understanding about Christ as having both masculine and feminine aspects by many theologians in the Middle Ages. And it also made me think of like Carolee Schneemann's interior scroll. I mean, there were just all these like different directions which your piece was pointing. And then in the way that it was reproduced in the catalog, I also really liked. How I believe there's a photo of you on a staircase standing immediately below an image of like a bishop. And so inviting us to think too about like female clergy in relation to your performance. And anyway, just visually, there were so many exciting things going on, both like as a static image, but then seeing you live that were really thought-provoking for me.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thanks very much, Kate, for letting us put you on the spot. Do you want to add anything about omissions at all or anything like that? Or?
It's such a big, because there are so many constraints in organising a show of this scale, and we were taking on the medieval and contemporary art and life, secular and religious. Like the effort to try and kind of control the material was so. It took us a long time, didn't it? Sort of 4 years of work so there are many things that we could have done that we didn't do. And partly it's like the rule of shipping costs. I mean, what can you get? Yeah. What can you get over? But maybe, I don't know, just maybe to add a couple of details of inclusion, like the visitation records, correct me if I'm wrong, 1526 from Norwich, right, where we made a recording with some teenage boys reading the monks' accounts of their lives, and that you can listen to them as you're in the kind of naughty corner with Pavel's external examiner's report. And there are kind of accusations of sexual encounters in that dialogue, and the Godstow ring has a sort of unruly, romantic, erotic story that you drew out there. I'm not sure if there's something amongst the many things that we left out that I can point to specifically, but that's definitely I would agree that's the thing that we talked about most explicitly.
I think one of the interesting things about working on the project was that it is a project about art, but it's also about the stories you can tell with art. So in a way, the art led the sorts of stories that we told and that we could tell, and the stories came out of the sort of meeting points between the medieval and contemporary. So it was what stories can the art tell, and then it was what stories does the medieval and contemporary art tell together. And one of the places where that problem was particularly knotty was in the final section of the show, the choir, where we kind of aimed at the eternal, another small theme, easily resolved. So we wanted to represent prayer as the heart of monastic life, and we wanted to take the end of Benedict's rule seriously when he says all of this daily routine is just the starting point. We want to sort your community and your schedule so that you can think about higher things. But actually, what art represents that? And if you look to the medieval art of Benedictine monasteries linked to the choir in the 14th century, that art is really unruly and nothing like what you might think prayer looked like as art. You know, it's these psalters with their raucous marginalia and it's misericords. So the art challenged the kind of idea of what prayer was, and then that ends up being the story that we tell, that prayer is this kind of embodied, communal, kind of unruly, playful, collective experience as well.
Perhaps if I could just add to what I was saying about measurement and the immeasurable, maybe what you're talking about also is, you know, the relation through the measurement of the daily life in the monastery to the immeasurable, and the relationship of that through prayer, and maybe the problem, to just elaborate a bit on what I said, for us is we are in a society where everything is becoming measurable. Everything is becoming data, and data depends on measurement, and measurement is the means by which data is extracted, and a means by which our attention is extracted. And it's in the interests of the tech companies to be able to measure everything in order that they can sell it back to us. So, you know, we have the problem of where for us is the immeasurable and what should not be measured, you know, in a sense, in that, you know, what is beyond measure, and perhaps also what shouldn't be subjected to this kind of measurement. And that idea of the measurable also comes out, I think, in Tacitus' work, you know, and works dealing with paradise through these discs, through these kind of absorptive. I think the question of paradise in Dante is actually to do with the relationship to the immeasurable.
Yeah, I mean, just a word on these. So these are 8 of 10 screen prints, and they are made after the hierarchy of angelic beings in the Prima Mobile, the 9th circle of Dante's, or 9th sphere of Dante's Paradise. So there is quite a strict ordering, isn't there, of sort of angelic beings in this. But it's, others will know more about this than me, but you know, the Prima Mobile is that place where the Empyrean, you know, of God's realm touches or bears upon or engages material existence in some fashion, or you know, the angel as a conduit. So I think there's quite a lot of interesting stuff about film and medium there and light. But the precision of the hierarchy is the sort of interesting aspect.
Yeah, definitely. I think Susan Morris, this comes out as well, actually. I think that was a very nice pendant to these in a way, her tapestry works, which are kind of glistening and really, they sort of have an air of the medieval in terms of the sheer beauty of them as objects, and yet they are about that absolute kind of measurability of the human day via the Fitbit.
And unruliness.
And unruliness, yes, exactly. Yeah, who is it staying up in the middle of the night? It's probably me. I don't think I want my daily life tracked. You wouldn't want to know. But I think, yeah, just that relationship between materiality and form, I guess, that sometimes seems to come outside of the boxes that we put modernity and medievalism into in a really fun, unruly way. Really comes through. Yeah. Should we turn this over to questions, see if anybody's got anything they want to interject with? We do have a microphone, so if you've got a question, put your hand up and we'll bring it over to you.